Look at that handsome guy, practicing his Mendelssohn at a cool 115 beats per minute, like a good musician should. He should probably check his ego a little bit though, because he's not playing nearly as in time as he thinks he is. He's using that metronome as a crutch, slightly off here, slightly off there, but always able to recover quickly and adjust slightly because he has that constant clicking in his ear. He can get a little ahead or a little behind, but as long as that clicking keeps going, he'll always be able to get back on time. But I wonder what would happen if somebody took that metronome away from him. He's rushing the shit out of it and falling apart. Shocking. So, I'm sure I'm not the only one who has ever had this happen. You work up a difficult passage slowly with a metronome, just like everyone has always told you to do, and you get it up to the tempo you want, and then you play it along with the metronome a few times at full speed. But then you take that metronome away, and all of a sudden you can't play in time anymore. You either rush or you drag. So then you go back and work with the metronome some more and come back and the same thing happens. And this happens over and over and you can't quite figure out how to stop yourself from rushing or dragging. It seems like no matter how many times you do this over and over, you always get the same result. Well, the problem is you're actually relying on that metronome to keep time for you. Metronomes are great for when you are first learning a passage. It gives you a goalpost to shoot for and helps keep everything even. But when you consistently have it on every beat, your inner subdivision stops working for itself and you just go off the feel of the metronome. Once you can play a passage at full speed, the metronome becomes more of a crutch and less of a practice tool. You need to develop a different skill, your internal subdivision. You need to develop the skill of maintaining that tempo without relying on anything. And we can actually do that with the metronome. We just need to use it differently. Instead of putting it on every beat, we start setting the clicks further and further apart. Because the beats are so far apart, we can no longer rely on the feel of the metronome and have to start relying on the feel of our own internal sense of time. In this way, the metronome becomes more of a check and less of a crutch. And if you record yourself doing this, how far off your timing really is will be much more obvious with less beats. So how do we go about doing this? What we're going to do is we're going to make a couple separate recordings, and every single time we're going to reduce the amount of metronome clicks by half. So the first one, instead of every quarter note, it'll be on every half note. Then the next one will be every whole note. And then the last one will be every other whole note. From there, we can evaluate which spots we have the most trouble keeping time in. And then we'll separate those out and work on them individually. after listening through to all three versions, there seem to be several problems that need to be addressed, and they all became more obvious with less beats. The rushing of the 16ths in the last version was very obvious towards the end. But for the sake of time, let's focus on just one area that was shaky throughout all the versions of the recording. Measure 237 to 240. The quarters here always seem too slow, and the faster rhythms would have to compensate by going faster. So we've identified the problems and the spots where we are having them, but what do we do about fixing them? The first thing we're going to do is break this down into chunks. Before being able to play those 4 measures in time, we need to be able to play each measure in time on its own. Starting with the first measure, we'll set the metronome to click on every other half note once per measure. We'll then begin to count subdivisions in our head and try to match the downbeat of the metronome click. Do this first by clapping or tapping the exact time you think the next clip is coming while counting in your head. After you can consistently do that, play the first note of that measure on your instrument with the metronome. Once you can do that, add in the second half note of this measure, where the next big beat would happen. In this case, it's a G natural. Once that is good, play through the whole measure and line up that first note with the metronome click. Now move on to the second measure and repeat a similar process. Obviously the rhythm is more active in this measure, but the same concept applies. Try singing the rhythm out loud with the metronome before playing the measure for things that are a little more complicated, such as this. Now go back and chunk the first and second measure together and play through them a few times with the metronome clicking on the downbeat of every measure. Then reduce the metronome by half and have it click on the downbeat of every other measure. This would mean you play this 2-measure chunk all at once within 1 metronome click. If you can do this a few times in a row, you know that you can rely on your internal subdivision to play these 2 measures in time. Repeat the same exact process for the next 2 measures. And then chunk them together with the first 2 measures, with the metronome first on every measure and then on every other measure. The ultimate test would be to have the metronome click on the beginning of the treble spot and then not click again until the treble spot is over. This would mean you hear a downbeat once every 4 measures in this instance. If you can do that consistently, your time is going to be very solid throughout these measures. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. And if you have any suggestions on how to work on your sense of pulse, please leave them down in the comments. Thanks.